Hello, friends. This is a continuation of our adventures in identification. And we have had 8 programs so far. The last one was just a half hour in duration. And we'll see how far this one goes. If you have difficulty looking at the last one in 1-hour segments, we'll try to correct that as we go. In front of us we have the diagram of Parabrahm, and it's difficult to know whether we are referring to the absolute Parabrahman, which is the infinite being underlying all of the cosmos, or whether we're looking at something that we might call a cosmic Parabrahm, such as we find on page 344 of the Treatise on Cosmic Firebolt. Here, a cosmic Parabrahman. It might be that that is what we are looking at. If we're looking at the true Parabrahm, then we have something which really cannot be represented in any diagrammatic way. My intention now is to just kind of think with you about things. It's such a deep subject, even though the masters of the wisdom have achieved the true identification, and even though for them it is at this point second nature, we are struggling towards it. And it's a matter of great subtlety. It can appear, it can emerge suddenly without warning. We're told that some of the great sages have been enlightened suddenly by an unexpected perception. The old story goes that even a fly can be the enlightener. There is a configuration of energies in the consciousness of the person who is about to be enlightened, which can be triggered into coherence suddenly and unexpectedly. Such a person, such an individual, is a bit like a supersaturated solution, if you've seen how this operates. There is no crystallization yet in a supersaturated solution, but just the addition of one crystal can make the entire solution turn crystalline. And suddenly you have a solid where before you had a liquid. Suddenly you have something definite, whereas before all was fluid. As I've been saying, I've been writing, it seems, notebooks forever, keeping journals. I've gone through many different stages of my thought. I think my thought was very, in a way, Vedantic, starting from 1991. This is 21 years ago. I remember we had a meeting of seekers. It was with Brother Keith Bailey. It was at his house in New York, and it emerged at that meeting that the Tibetan teacher had asked every one of his close students to have a copy of the Viveka Kudamani, the crest jewel of discrimination by Shankara in their possession, in his or her possession. It certainly rang a bell for me at the time, and that began a 5-year pursuit. There was a particular translation of that crest jewel of discrimination. I think it was the Chatterjee translation. I got a number of the translations. And just a tiny little book of, paperback book printed in India from maybe it included all the ancient writings in relation to that. It was a very humble little book, 100 pages maybe, 120 pages, small. But it became, for me, and I still carry it in my computer bag, a great point of reference. I read it over and over again because I was intent at the time on a closer relationship to reality, or a deeper identification with or as reality. I know that during this writing, at some point, the writing really began, I think, in 1994, but a lot of preparation began from 91 to that point. And then it lasted maybe 2 years before the book was ready, and Victoria Stone helped me a great deal with that book, undertaking a very, very difficult task, I think. Trying to keep my thoughts straight, telling me when things were comprehensible and not comprehensible. Of course, I was a very bad person for whom to edit. The blue line didn't find its way into the writings very extensively, but it was very, very helpful, and the few illustrations that exist in that book we owe to her thought that there really should be somehow some illustrations, as I'm not the type that tends to use illustrations, however helpful they may be. I tend to be a person more of the word, more inclined to think that the word can convey what it must, but of course that's not entirely true. So this effort some 20 years ago, or 18 even to 16 years ago, was as close an approach as I could make. I've got notebooks full of all kinds of perceptions. It was as if I was kind of possessed by some higher perspective at that time, and I did notice that the moon was in Capricorn during much of the writing of the book, which for me meant it was kind of a summit perception, taking my point of consciousness as high as I possibly could, and then seeing what I could see. As DK says, climbing the mountain of realization, or the mountain of vision, yourself. So at that time, I really didn't consult the Tibetan's books very much. I simply used the Vivekachudamani in that one little humble translation, this book by Shankara, who was a great sage, in many ways equal to the Buddha. We don't exactly know when he lived, but it seemed to be BC, really. And as DK said, he had some very interesting perceptions on the nature of the self. He mentions him as one of the great teachers in the sequence. I believe he does that in the Reappearance of the Christ. I'm tempted to find that, if I possibly can. It's always interesting when you get the exact word, but Shankara, Let's see here. So here's the reference. And it talks about the great teachers in the reappearance of the Christ. Buddha taught that misery and suffering were of man's own making, and that the focusing of human desire upon the undesirable, the ephemeral, the material, was the cause of all despair, all hatred and competition, and the reason why man found himself living in the realm of death, the realm of physical living, which is the true death of the spirit. He made a unique contribution to the teaching given by Hercules and Vyasa. So Hercules was an Atlantean teacher, you see. Between the times, they had erected, added to the structure of truth which earlier teachers had erected, and thus the Buddha prepared the way for the Christ. Between the times of these two great teachers, the Buddha and the Christ, lesser teachers appeared to amplify and add to the already given basic truth. So this does pinpoint when Shankaracharya existed. Some people have put him in the 8th century A.D. This is not apparently what the Buddha, the Tibetan thinks. Shankaracharya was one of the most important, giving as he did deep instruction upon the nature of the self. And also the teacher in the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna, must be noted, for many believe him to be a previous incarnation of the Christ. But there we seem to be a little bit out of sequence, because if the time of the Buddha was approximately 600 BC, 6 to 500 BC, the time of Krishna was said to be more like 3000 BC. So one wonders how these two beings could have flourished between the time of the Buddha and the Christ, unless, of course, we have an earlier Buddha who was not Gautama per se, but was the true head of the spiritual hierarchy, not one who had to search for the method of becoming a 5th degree initiate or a 6th degree initiate, but one who already was 5th degree initiate as the head of the hierarchy. Anyway, about Shankara, he gave deep instruction upon the nature of the self. And that is what I became extremely interested in 1991. Well, I guess I had always been interested in it. You know, as I said in one of the earlier, perhaps the very first program I made on this, which went all to black, when I met my in-person teacher, his whole theme was identity, as you might expect with Leo on the Ascendant, but it was a very subtle form of understanding identity, because the man had 5 or 6 planets in Pisces, which gave him that Neptunian capacity to transcend boundaries and to identify himself. If you're looking for a planet of identification, or one of the most important, is Neptune. So Pisces and Neptune give a tremendous capacity for that. And I think rather than to have learned any particular piece of knowledge from him, it was more the presence, the darshan, the understanding of what it was to be with a person who had identified as the larger self, not to be impractical at all, because he was very practical. He'd spent a lot of his life simply, I think, you know, in humble jobs, simply as a custodian, taking care of big machines, in big buildings, that kind of thing. Very practical work. But from another perspective, the I that he used was not the conventional I at all. It had, in a way, nothing individual about it. That doesn't mean that he ignored his own individuality as a personality or had not accumulated much as a soul. But the operative I for him is what I sometimes use when I draw that figure 8. The operative I was the extensive I, the generalized I, a more pervading I, which was not limited by any of the usual rings past not. In a way, it wasn't limited by any entity in cosmos. It was the principle of I-ness, of true, all-pervading selfhood. And he particularly identified with the justice aspect of that I-ness, its inherent balance and fairness, and all-powerful presence in all things. So I think, for me, the seed was planted, and I really learned something that could not have been conveyed to me in another way. All of my, very fine, more conventional relatives felt that this man had absolutely ruined my life. But of course, as I may have said, it was to me the granting of real life and the planting of the seed of that which would ripen later after much exploration of knowledge. In this life, there's had to be a lot of accumulation of knowledge, not necessarily of a mundane sort, but of an esoteric sort, for which I thank all the theosophical writers and Blavatsky, and most of all the Tibetan, whose presentation of knowledge in the form of meticulous entirety is unsurpassed as far as I can see. So this fascination with selfhood, in a non-specific way, mostly when we speak of the self, we speak of a specific collection of qualities and patterns which is identifiably distinct from other selfhoods. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that which goes beyond quality per se, and yet manages to include them all. I'm talking about that which is no color, but which is the synthesis of all color. The white radiance of eternity I'm speaking of. I wonder if I'm correct it's something like life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity. I'm speaking of the white radiance of eternity, which is the all-pervading and generalized self, which ever has been, according to the ancient scriptures, those that are most trustworthy and not distorted by the limitations of egoism. It's never had a beginning, it never has an end, and we are that, and that's the root of all the esoteric philosophy. Thou art that. So, so often in my notebooks I tend to write about these things, quite apart from any other meditation program I may be pursuing along a more practical line, and DK certainly gives these practical approaches. I tend always to gravitate back to the question of identity, of identification, of being, and the love and the joy that are implicit in those types of realizations. The realization of identity and the realization of being. So, during this last Wesak, as is often the case during the unfathomable, pristine stillness of Wesak, thoughts began to come to me and a kind of inspiration. So many times I've been inspired by these impressions, but, simply put them in a notebook somewhere, and, notebooks come and go, and many of us went to see the Dalai Lama in Washington this past year, almost a year ago, really, about a little more than 10 months ago. And I've got, like 6 notebooks full of impressions that were gathered at that time. But what to do with them? There they sit right down here in my cabinet, adding to the many, many notebooks from which I need to blow off the dust some fine day. But I'm hoping that as life goes on, there is a synthesis which begins to occur in the understanding and the consciousness that helps one harvest the main points of many jottings. The jottings would then be something like recollection, that there be no recollection and yet let memory rule. And the memory would be the harvest of all those recollections. So I'm kind of comforting myself by thinking that maybe not too much is lost if I never see those notebooks again, but that somehow in me the collection of the understanding is now resident. Of course, there are many triggers in notebooks. Triggers are particular magic words that I find, particular combinations of words, which are keys to special types of perception. I do think that people should find out what for them are the triggers. They will probably be words of their own formulation. They are for me. Maybe there are ancient keys and open sesames for people in the general literature of occultism and esotericism. I think there are. But I find that the ones that I formulate for myself, it's probably some sort of third-rate, fourth-rate approach, are the ones that most effectively and directly open the door to new dimensions of perception, which are not always on the surface of consciousness. But just as a person who has not breathed for a long time is in deep need of breath, it becomes the most urgent thing for him or her. So it is with me when I have not thought about identification for a long time. Let's say many, many busy things are preoccupying my attention, and weeks may pass, even a month may pass, when I've not had a chance for really deep meditation on these particular subjects. Then a great need arises in me, and if that need coincides with a particularly potent full moon, so much the better, just as it did this past Wesak. It doesn't mean that one cannot have very deep perceptions at other times. At Wesak, there's this sense of the Lord of the world, of the ruler of Shambhala, and of the Buddha as the emissary of him. And one of the deepest realizations that I've had is that somehow this being, Sanat Kumara, pervades us, is in us. is inescapably present as one layer of the universal presence. And sometimes, there are these pictures of the masters, and some of them I think are very good, and others may be a little bit distorted. But there have been times when I've looked into the eyes of those pictures, and I've sensed within them, within those eyes, and all the masters gathered together, a number of them, the presence of the being within each one of them, the being who is them, the being who somehow includes them, this presence of the Lord of the world, of Sanat Kumara, who is an emanation, I would say, of the planetary logos, and therefore is the planetary logos at a certain level of immersion or of incarnation. And so looking into the eyes of the masters, I feel this presence. And then it is my task to vivify this presence and stimulate my awareness of this presence in all other phases of perception, to somehow identify the presence and identify as the presence, so that the presence is always present. And it's so easy to be distracted. There are 10 million preoccupations that can lower one's point of tension in an instant. And that, of course, shows that we have not yet arrived when that happens to us. Because, that ability to hold the identification with will, undeviatingly, unchangeably, no matter what the circumstances may be. It's like being able to hold to the realization of being in the presence or being the presence, at one with the presence, no matter what the distractions may be. That obviously has to be practiced, has to be such a potent demand within one's consciousness that one does not relinquish that task, no matter what the other preoccupations may be. Now, here is a little paragraph on the esoteric significance of tension, because when one does not allow one's consciousness to deviate from the sense of identification or from the sense of will, it is a point of tension which is being applied. Here we have the esoteric significance of tension, as far as I can explain it by limiting words, is focused, immovable will. Right tension is the identification of brain and soul with a will aspect. All three aspects are aligned here. That which represents the foundation, and the middle point, and the higher point. Right tension is the identification of brain and soul with the will aspect, and the preservation of that identification, unchanged and immovable, no matter what the circumstances and the difficulties. Once we master this ability to hold an identification with and as unchanged and immovable, we are in the position to know how to sustain that through all vicissitudes, and to have it become the dominating theme of our consciousness, even though while doing so we can handle and must handle many practical matters. I've been working with the faculty of the Moria Federation on these rules, and also coming up in just another week or so, I have a class in Denmark which will begin the studying of the rules and maybe some of the studies in the latter part of the book simultaneously, as has been suggested to me. Okay. So during this Wesak, I began to realize very much the true sense in which the presence is in us. My picture keeps freezing here. Perhaps it's just a little too big. The sense of Sanat Kumara, or the spirit of this planet, which is not the same as the spirit of the earth, but the spirit of this planet being in all things, in us, and in fact being all things within this planetary sphere, all subsumed within him as a presence, came home to me very vividly. And it was a kind of rejoicing for me, the sense of the glory of this presence. I like that word glory because it suggests, I know it's kind of a sixth-grade word, you know, but it suggests a full effulgence, a fully expressed radiation of all quality, which is within any particular source. And so it's a maximalization, a radiant maximalization of potential. And I really sense the imminent glory of this presence, and how it would go on from glory to glory, increasing in its radiance the deeper we could master the art of identification. I felt that all things were being made one in this presence, and he, the presence, I don't know, should we call it he, you know, whatever we call it, this great consciousness, this great being, that we were made one in this presence. Each of us realized our connectedness because the presence was realized vividly. In the presence we became one. Well, we're always one, but we all know how often that realization can slip out of consciousness, and we are returned to lower fragmentation, and the actions and reactions of time and space take over our consciousness instead of the presence of essential being, which should obliterate those actions and reactions of time and space when we're truly in a condition of will. Actually, I want to read that because it's really, you know, it's a fantastic thing about that something new and different that comes into the equipment of the individual when that individual, probably in group form, has made the first contact with Shambhala and with the Lord of the world. And all of this is some kind of eventuality which we can anticipate at the time of the third initiation or thereabouts. One pretty well has to prove that one is initiate before one is initiated. So there's something new that's added. It is a blinding conviction of unalterable will. This is through Shambhalic contact. Blinding conviction of unalterable will carrying all before it. It's an irresistible force, really. Oblivious of time and space. aware only of intensity of direction. There is an objective, and there is an intense focus upon this objective, and as in the first ray integration formula, the ears are closed to all the outer voices. The hands clenched, the body braced, the mind alert. Intensity of direction oblivious of time and space, which is not to say they don't exist for other people. And they don't, they do exist at certain states of consciousness, but they have faded in this particular state of consciousness, which results from the contact with Shambhala, or with the monad. Aware only of intensity of direction and carrying with it two major qualifications or basic recognitions to the initiate. And this is what I was referring to. A sense of essential being, which obliterates all the actions and reactions of time and space. The impression of essential being is so strong that time is collapsed into the moment, the eternal now, the now. And space is collapsed into the point. And our consciousness is not preoccupied with such questions as, where is it? How long does it take? The sequentiality of our normal perceptions is banished, and the idea of extension, that term which philosophers like to discuss, the appearance that things are extended in space, that is also collapsed, and all spaces or places are seen to be here and now. So we really have the here and now. I'm thinking about the perception that Baba Ram Dass must have had in his book that he entitled Be Here Now. It was a step in the overcoming of time and space. Of course, as I may have sometimes said, the very appearance and disappearance of the universe on the Great Breath speaks in a way of supercosmic time and space. Those are big issues. But at least if within our own sphere of consciousness and the planet, the solar system, and so forth, we can begin to get rid of the idea that we are bound by sequence. We can enter into simultaneity in the sense of the simultaneity of all processes in the universe. It's all happening and happening at the same time. If we can do that, and if we can get rid of the idea that it takes time to cover space, because actually it doesn't when we're dealing with the realm of spirit, then we've taken at least the first step in overcoming those categories of consciousness, as Kant would say, which are named by us, time and space. So essential being becomes the obtruding fact of consciousness. It overpowers every other kind of perception and is seen to subsume, to absorb every content of consciousness. So that's one of the qualifications or basic recognitions that comes to the initiate, with that touch of Shambhala, which is the first touch, I think, of the life aspect. This monad is conveying to us some indication of the life aspect, something we cannot really define, just as we cannot define will, says DK. And the other is this focused will to good, which is so dynamic in its effect that evil disappears. We're overcoming here the great heresy of separateness or separativeness. The good is found, well, where is it found? It's certainly found on the cosmic ethers and beyond. It's found on the monadic plane where 7 great sounds produce 7 great geometries, which are the first 7-fold forms, the first forms, 7 of them, on the cosmic physical plane, arising out of threefoldness on the logoic plane, as we are shown on page 344 of Cosmic Fire, chart 5. This will to archetypalization, this will to be congruent with the great sound geometry forms of the monadic plane. The good already exists, and there are relative degrees of good in the dense physical vehicle of the planetary and solar logos, but I call those worlds the mosaic worlds, and out of a mosaic, or out of the pieces, you can make an image which everyone recognizes as a whole, but it's still a fragmented image, and it reflects what I would call the unfragmented archetype of the monadic and logoic levels. I don't want to get too much into my infinity book here, but you know, where do archetypes really come from? And I would say that for our purposes and in relation to the cosmic physical plane, the archetypal worlds are especially the monadic plane and the logoic plane, where the 3 and the 7 demonstrate. The Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, is demonstrating there, in a way, through the 3 and the 7, through the 7 types of monads and the 3 types of major monads. So this essential being is what we're looking for when we speak of identification, because ultimately it is that with which we have to identify, and beyond that, as which we have to identify. And no matter what form we may confront, and all forms, really, that we perceive are contents of consciousness. You say, well, if I didn't have a consciousness, would they still exist? They would, because they are perceptions in much greater consciousnesses. So they have reality, a kind of objective reality, but only because they are perceived by much greater and more inclusive consciousness. Every content of consciousness, ultimately, is an act of self-perception. It's kind of the theory that I go with, and I try to develop that as I go along. But nevertheless, all that is perceived are now contents in our consciousness, and so they are for us subjective facts, even though they have their own kind of objectivity, because they are perceived. In other words, they don't go away when our consciousness blacks out. They're still there, because they are perceived by still greater and more inclusive consciousnesses. And they don't have any kind of independent reality. They are, all of them, self-perceptions. Ultimately, self-perceptions of the one universal being. I realize, that perhaps I will wander a little here. I'm just kind of, trying to share impressions. This presence makes itself felt, and the old Jesuit technique, and probably it's much older than the use by the Jesuits, where you practice the presence of God, or I like to call it the presence of the presence. I practice the all-pervading one. I practice the all-pervading presence. I seek to find ways of recognizing it. I have to be careful, I suppose, about whether I'm rested in this physical mechanism, whether I've eaten properly or not clogged my system with food and so forth. There are certain conditions. We are told that the work goeth forth by prayer and fasting. And the work is the work of deep perception in consciousness and then being able to direct the energy that is perceived towards useful ends. So there was this pervasion that I sensed, pervasion of each by the presence, and a sense of the all in all, the entirety as in each. Nothing allowed to escape its inclusion in God, the presence. There are many layers of this presence, but sometime I'd like to get into that because I think ultimately there's only one presence, but there are presences within presences within presences, various substratums. So each presence is a certain layer or scope or depth of a still deeper presence, and on it goes until we have the presence of the universal logos, which contains and is all presences. But that in itself is, that type of presence is just the merest expression, though the same in quality, the merest expression of that which always seems absent to us because it's unperceivable, but which is the ultimate presence, all in capital letters, you might say. Sometimes considered the great negation, but why should it not be considered the ultimate in positivity? The one being that is uncreated and ever has been and ever will be, that to me is the ultimate presence, but it can't be present to anything else because there is nothing else. It can only be in a way present to itself. We'd have to be very careful how we think about this, because we get into a realm of abstractions here. I call it the infinitessence. Really, it shouldn't be named, you know, but one tries to come to terms with what everybody considers to be a negation, the unapproachable, that which lies across the infinite gap between the universe and it. If we fall a little bit into meditative moments, it's just that the whole consideration of this subject should be meditative. This is not the discursive mind just reasoning about these things. This is the attempt to come closer to touch the ultimate intangibles. Well, let's call it the penultimate intangibles. We're not going to be touching that which cannot be touched, untouched. There's nothing to touch it. There's nothing else. So this sense of being pervaded by the immediate presence of Sanat Kumara, the Lord of this planet, who is but a tiny aspect of still greater presences, and in a way pervaded by them all, in such a way that as the consciousness advances, one presence after another, all part of the greatest one presence, can be discerned detected and identified with, because in that light we shall see light. Well, perhaps at the moment we see or register only one layer of the universal presence, that which has to do with our particular planetary manifestation. But later, there will be different layers. It may be that we can detect the presence of Sanat Kumara as the planetary logos, or some great being who is the true director of the hierarchy as his ashram. The incarnation of the planetary logos, that particular presence, we can begin to touch a little, or we imagine we do. But then there will come the time when, having met Sanat Kumara face to face, and even having taken the 7th initiation, a deeper presence will be revealed, a presence that was there all along but undetectable, because we had not the conscious penetrative power to fathom that it was present. And that would be the presence of the Solar Logos. And on it will go, we can only imagine, with one presence after another revealed. A formal non-absence. It's just here. It's just implicate. It is substanding all the other registrations and is seen as the most essential fact of consciousness at any one moment. But that particular fact will one day give way to a still greater presence and fact, and on, until we do one day, of course not, but in one moment in time, one moment in the duration of our cosmos, recognize the supreme universal presence, which is the universal logos, the ultimate God of our universe, though not necessarily the ultimate God, because even this supreme universal logos is simply a layer of infinitesimal depth when compared to the ever-perfect, ever-present, and seemingly absent absolute. These are all things that, lie ahead of us, but yet, in a way, we have experienced them over and over again, endlessly. We are the one being, which we are, is the veteran of infinitudinous universes. It's been breathing forever. And never is the time that we have not been. Never is the time that there has not been either an out-breath, or an in-breath, or the holding of the breath. The intervals in which time appears to disappear involve the holding of the breath, the utter retraction of the breath. It's not just the in-breath, it's actually the retention of the breath in a state of non-universe, but in a state of infinitudinous plenitude, where the perfection is enjoyed by itself, and where the highest aspect of beingness is inperienced. A God, then, all in all, the universal deity, not the universal deity, the ultimate deity, all in its unchanging perfection. But of course, we cannot speculate with accuracy. How would we know? And even, I mean, speculation may be somewhat satisfying to the sense of mental extension. But what good it does, we will only one day know, and I think what it does is expand our anticipation of universal glory. It gives us inspiration and incentive, but as far as the accuracy goes, who knows? But I am of the opinion that even a solar logos being as a crystal, still some greater beings must speculate, or at least reach out in its own ways towards that which it cannot touch. So this sense that there are no conventional boundaries for the pervading one. You know, I might call Sanat Kumara, in planetary terms, the all-pervading one. That, of course, would be a limitation upon the universal all-pervading one and the ultimate all-being one. But for practical purposes, you know, we seek integration into the plan and purpose of God, our planetary logos. So in a way, he is the all-pervading one, even though we know that he is pervaded and substood or substandard by still more subtle and intense and encompassing presences, such as next, the presence of the solar logos. So we are uniting with each other in them, as them. That all-pervading one experiences all within the planetary ring Pasnat, you know. Not a sparrow falls, we are told, but that it is registered by the all-pervading one, for an aspect of the all-pervading one is changing form, has fallen. The all-pervading one experiences all, is in the thick of the experience, is the I within the experience, the EYE and the I too, the identity within the experience. That all-pervading one, which we are, is experiencing all. And this means that we, once we discover our fusion within and as the all-pervading one, we find, at least theoretically, that we are even now and always experiencing all. There's not a human being, let's keep it on the human level for a moment, in whom we are not. If the all-pervading one is there, we are there, because you cannot separate us in essence from the all-pervading one. So whoever is experiencing, we are experiencing, whether in this body, on this side of the veil, or in the disembodied state, we are there and we are experiencing. There is but, you know, how many eyes are there? As many units of sentiency as there are eyes, identity points. Those eyes are not all self-conscious yet, but they're all experiencing, and all of the many, many eyes are but one eye, identity and point of perception. And when you use the word I, you've got to, it's spelled differently in English, you've got to think of both, an identity point and a point of perception. All of them form but one eye, one identity point, and one act of perception. And sometimes, you know, we could just extend our imagination out so that we could be within any apparently distinct perceiver and realize that that experience is our experience. We would be moving along the line of identification. Well, you know, I just got this little notebook here, just one of 200, I just like to use these thoughts as kind of points of departure, just to talk with you and just talk to myself in a way. Well, if I'm talking to you, I am talking to myself, and then, of course, you can say it theoretically, but one has to get the heart feeling of that. See, there is no identification without the heart involvement. And I also think, the heart within the head involvement. I also think the egoic lotus involvement, although that is not necessarily abiding, one has to be involved in heart, which is an organ of sentiency and feeling, in order to really identify. So as we talk about these things, somewhat slowly perhaps, because I think I would be a fool to try to rush into these subjects with a rapid rate of speech, because I'm searching even as I'm talking. And it takes time to assimilate, to find and to assimilate. And it takes much repetition. A person might just get it in an instant, just like that. Or it could take, lifetimes of repetition before that, just like that moment occurs. Okay, well, it's Mother's Day here, and it's just a moment of quiet in the house, and I'd like to continue in a way, but I also think it might be wise just to get this simple, approximately hour-long program off to you, which I will do, and I'll just close it, not with a great invocation at this time, but just with an Om, which reminds us of the unity in which we exist, that unity in which we are attempting to achieve a still greater level of realization, which we call identification. It's such a beautiful day. I wish I could show it to you. In Finland, it's often a cold place, but when the spring comes, it's very beautiful. And the sun is shining, a few clouds in the sky, and all is still. We're at the higher interlude of the year. It seems a good time at which to try to appreciate some of these deeper things which only show themselves when the commotion ceases. Okay, we will be on with it a little later. We'll continue, and this one is number 9, and Adventures in Identification number 10 will be coming. See you then.